Some people walk into a room and the temperature drops. Not because they're cold exactly, but because everything about them says, don't get close. That was him. That was always him. Mia had worked for Sebastian Harlow for exactly 2 years, 3 months, and 11 days. Not that she was counting. Okay, she was counting. But only because every single one of those days it felt like walking on thin ice in glass shoes. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end, and let me know which city you're listening from. That way, I can see how far my story has traveled. Because this story, it went places I never expected. Places that broke me open. Places that put me back together again. In ways I am still, even now, try to fully understand. But let me start at the beginning. Sebastian Harlow was the kind of man who spoke in 4-word sentences and somehow made you feel like you had wasted his time with all 4 of them. He never raised his voice. That was the terrifying part. Loud bosses you can brace for. You hear them coming. But Sebastian was quiet, and his quiet had edges. He would look at you over the rim of his glasses, and you would suddenly forget your own name. Mia had spent 2 years convincing herself she despised him. It felt safe, hating him. Simple. Neat. Like a box she could put him in and close the lid on. He was the ruthless CEO with the tailored suit and the dead eyes and the heart that ran on efficiency and quarterly reports. She was the creative director who stayed late not because she wanted his approval, but because she actually cared about the work. They existed in parallel lines. Near each other. Never touching. Until the plane. It was a Tuesday. She remembered because she had spilled coffee on her sketchbook that morning and spent 20 minutes crying about it in the bathroom, which felt very embarrassing in retrospect given everything that came after. The company jet was small, polished, impossibly quiet. The kind of quiet that belongs to money. Leather seats, walnut trim, air that smelled faintly like someone had once placed fresh flowers in the cabin just to establish a mood. Mia sat across the aisle from him, her laptop balanced on her knees, putting the final touches on a design proposal that was due the moment they landed. He hadn't looked at her once since they boarded. "Is the report ready?" he asked, eyes still on his tablet. "Almost, sir," she said, her fingers moving faster. "Sir." She always said sir. She wasn't sure when she had started doing that. Probably around the 3rd or 4th time he had dismissed one of her ideas in a meeting without blinking, and she had decided that professional distance was her only form of armor. The turbulence started gently. A little shake, like the sky stretching. Mia barely noticed. She was used to small jets. They moved differently than commercial flights, a little more responsive to the air around them, a little more honest about what the weather was doing. She kept typing, but then it didn't stop. The shaking grew. Not violent yet, just insistent. Her coffee slid in its cup holder. She glanced out the window and saw clouds that hadn't been there a moment ago, thick and bruised and low. Mild turbulence, she told herself. Totally normal. And then the plane lurched sideways like something had grabbed it by the tail. Her laptop hit the floor. Her hands flew to the armrests. Across the aisle, she saw Sebastian Harlow grip his seat, and oh, the sight of it did something to her she wasn't prepared for because his knuckles had gone white and his jaw was tight and his eyes, those cold, unreadable eyes, had changed. Something had moved behind them. Something very human and very afraid. And before she could process that, the engine coughed. One single, terrible cough. And then silence where the engine used to be. Mia had read once that it's not the noise of a plane crash that's the worst part. It's the quiet before it. The moment the sound is gone and your body understands what your brain is still refusing to accept. That silence lasted maybe 3 seconds. Then the world came apart. The plane dropped the way nightmares drop. Suddenly, completely, with nothing to hold on to. Mia's stomach left her body. The horizon outside the window spun into a smear of green and gray. Alarm screamed. An overhead bin burst open and a jacket flew past her face like a startled bird. She grabbed the armrests and held on, and she thought, this is it. And the thought wasn't dramatic. It wasn't like the movies. It was just small and cold and very, very honest. This is it. She looked across the aisle. Sebastian looked at her. For one moment, one fragile slice of time, all of it fell away. The distance. The formality. The 2 years of carefully maintained professional chill. He wasn't the CEO. She wasn't the employee. They were just two people in free fall looking at each other the way humans do when there are no more masks left to wear. Then the trees hit, or they hit the trees. She would never be quite sure which way to say it. The impact was like being inside sound. Metal screaming. Something struck her shoulder hard enough to knock breath from her lungs. Glass fractured into light. The world tilted, crumpled, went dark. And then there was nothing. When she opened her eyes, the first thing she noticed was the smell. Fuel and wet earth and something green, something alive, something that had no business being comforting and was anyway. She was still in her seat. A tree branch had come through the cabin wall about 6 inches from her head. She stared at it for a long time. Alive. The word arrived slowly. I'm alive. She unbuckled her seatbelt with shaking fingers. Her legs barely held her as she stepped through a jagged opening in the fuselage and into the forest. She just stood there for a moment, breathing. Trees in every direction. Green, so thick it was almost a sound. No roads. No buildings. No voices. The plane was wrapped around the base of 3 trees like it had been trying to become part of them. Smoke rose from one wing. The other wing was simply gone. No other voices. No movement. Just the sound of her own terrified heartbeat. And then she heard him. A low groan, a few yards to her left. She turned. Sebastian was slumped against a tree. His suit jacket was torn at the shoulder. His tie, that immaculate silver tie she had watched him straighten 100 times in the reflective elevator doors, was gone. Blood ran in a thin line down from his temple, curving along his jaw. He looked up at her. Are you hurt? He asked. His voice was rough, scraped raw. I don't think so, she whispered. He tried to stand. His legs went sideways. Without thinking, without a single second of professional calculation, Mia crossed the space between them and grabbed his arm. She felt the warmth of him through the ruined sleeve of his shirt. Felt him lean into her just slightly. Just enough. It was the first time she had ever touched him. They searched the wreckage together, calling out. Their voices moved through the trees and came back empty. When they finally stopped, standing in the broken debris of the cabin, the truth settled over them both like cold water. They were alone. Sebastian straightened. She could see him doing it, the reassembling of himself, layer by layer, the way you can watch someone put on armor if you know what you're looking at. He looked at her with something steadier in his eyes. We're going to survive this, he said quietly. I promise you that. And Mia, who had spent 2 years not trusting a single word this man said, felt something in her chest go very still. She believed him. She had no idea why, but she did. And you won't believe what happened next, when the fire came to life in his hands, and she realized she had never known him at all. Mia had designed logos for international companies. She had sat in boardrooms in 4 countries. She had once talked a client out of making their rebrand entirely beige through sheer force of articulate passion. She considered herself a reasonably capable person. She had absolutely no idea how to survive a forest. Sebastian apparently did. She watched him from a few steps away, this man she had filed under cold corporate avoid if possible, and she felt something shift in her understanding of him the way plates shift under the earth. Quiet, invisible, changing everything. He had rolled his sleeves to the elbow. His hands, those hands she had only ever seen on keyboards or gesturing across glass conference tables or signing documents with a fountain pen that probably cost more than her first car. Those hands were dirty, scratched, moving with a kind of patient, quiet focus she had never seen from him before. He shaved bark from a branch with a strip of torn metal. He gathered dry leaves and arranged them with slow care. He held the metal strip at an angle and worked it, and worked it, and worked it. How do you know how to do this? She asked softly. My father, he said, not looking up. He believed a man should be able to survive with nothing but what the world gives him. A ribbon of smoke curled upward. He leaned close and blew the softest, most careful breath she had ever witnessed from a man who had always seemed to breathe only in commands. A tiny ember glowed. A fragile flame opened like a small hand reaching. Mia's throat tightened in a way she hadn't expected. She pressed her lips together. It was just fire. It was just fire, and she was absolutely not going to cry about it. She cried about it a little. They built a small camp near the wreckage. He salvaged with quiet efficiency, pulling panels of cabin lining free, finding wire, testing the strength of branches. A shelter took shape between two trees, rough and small and somehow sturdy. He moved like someone who had been taught to think 3 steps ahead of comfort, 3 steps ahead of despair. Mia tried to help. She mostly got in the way. "Do you know how to tie a secure knot?" he asked, holding out a length of cord. "Not really, no. That's all right." He paused. "I'll show you." He stood behind her, not uncomfortably close, just close enough that his voice was at her ear and his hands could guide hers through the loops of the cord. His voice was low and patient in a way she had never, not once in 2 years, heard from him in a professional context. His fingers brushed hers, adjusting the knot, and she felt a warmth run up her arm that she immediately, aggressively, attributed to proximity and cold weather. "Why are you being like this?" she asked before she could stop herself. He was quiet. He sat down on a fallen log and looked into the fire for a long moment. "In the office," he said finally, "I am what people expect me to be. Well, my uncle made me after my parents died." He looked at the trees around them. "Out here, there's no board, no stock price, no image I have to protect." Something in his voice went very quiet. "There's only this." Mia looked at him, really looked at him, maybe for the first time. She had assumed the coldness was who he was. She had never considered that someone might be cold because warmth had been taken from them. That night, the temperature dropped like a stone. She had underestimated how fast warmth leaves the body in a forest at night, with no shelter worth speaking of, and no blankets, and the damp cold rising from the earth beneath you. She sat near the fire and hugged her knees and shivered anyway, the kind of shiver that comes from inside your bones and doesn't care how many layers you're theoretically wearing. Sebastian stood without a word, removed his torn jacket, held it out to her. "No," she said immediately. "You'll freeze. I'm warmer than you are." "Sebastian, I'm warmer than you are," he said again, with a gentleness that was almost unbearable coming from him. She took the jacket. It was still warm from his body. It smelled like smoke and something underneath the smoke, something she didn't have words for yet, something that was simply him. She pulled it around her shoulders and didn't thank him right away because her throat had done something complicated. He sat across the fire from her and rubbed his arms slowly against the cold. Mia couldn't sleep. The forest at night is not like any darkness she had ever known. It breathes. It shifts. Every sound is something moving, something watching, something that might be coming closer. She lay on her back and stared up at the canopy and listened and couldn't stop. She kept glancing across the fire. He was shivering, not dramatically, not in a way he would ever have admitted, just the subtle tremor in his shoulders that a person sees when they're paying attention, when they know what to look for, when they have stopped pretending not to care. Before any rational thought could intervene, Mia stood up, walked around the fire, sat down beside him, draped the jacket over both of them so that the warmth was shared. He went very still. "What are you doing?" he asked, and his voice was careful in the way voices get when something unexpected has happened, and the speaker is trying very hard not to show how it has landed. "Sharing," she said simply. He looked at the jacket, then at her, then at the jacket again, and then, slowly, he leaned slightly toward her, just his shoulder against hers, just enough to take the warmth she was offering. Mia's heartbeat did something ridiculous. She stared into the fire and tried to remember all the reasons she had organized herself around. He was cold. He was ruthless. She had watched him in a meeting early because someone used the wrong graph scale, and she had seen the look on that person's face afterward, and it had made her own chest hurt. But the man beside her had given her his only layer of warmth while he sat shivering. These two things did not fit in the same box. She stopped trying to make them fit. When she finally slept, it was with her shoulder against his and the sound of the forest all around them. And for the first time since the plane went down, she didn't feel entirely alone inside the fear. In the morning, she woke to warmth and the smell of something savory and the sound of birds, and for 3 whole seconds she forgot everything. She was just warm, just breathing, just alive. Then she remembered. Sebastian was crouched by a small stream she hadn't noticed the day before. Two small fish were skewered on green sticks, turning slowly over the fire. He worked them with quiet attention, and when she sat up and made a sound, he glanced back over his shoulder. And he smiled. Not the smooth, polished, professionally calibrated smile she knew from presentations and client meetings. This one was smaller, almost shy, like it belonged to someone who didn't use it often and wasn't entirely sure it was welcome. "You caught those," she said. Her voice was still rough with sleep. They were slow in the cold water. He handed her a stick. "Eat. We need the strength." They ate in a silence that was nothing like the silence of the office. The office silence had always felt like a held breath, like everyone was waiting to be judged. This silence was something else, something that had earned its quiet. By midday, they had fallen into a strange, natural rhythm. He reinforced the shelter and checked the perimeter of the camp. She searched the nearby woods, and here is where something opened up in her that had nothing to do with Sebastian Harlow and everything to do with her grandmother. Her grandmother had lived in the countryside until she was very old. She had walked the fields every morning, naming things. Here is what heals. Here is what feeds. Here is what you can trust when everything else is gone. Mia had filled sketchbooks with those conversations, had drawn the plants in careful ink, had half forgotten all of it under years of deadlines and city living. Now she remembered. She came back to camp with broad leaves that could patch their shelter roof, a handful of edible roots, and a plant with soft, pale leaves her grandmother had pressed to cuts to draw out infection. Sebastian was sitting on a log, cleaning the gash on his forearm with water and a strip torn from his shirt. She crossed to him and knelt without asking. "Hold still," she said. She crushed the leaves against a stone until they released a pale green paste and spread it carefully over the wound. His arm was warm under her fingers. She could feel the slight tension in his muscles as she worked. "How do you know this?" he asked quietly. "My grandmother. She believed nature always had an answer, that you just had to be willing to look." He was quiet for a moment. "She sounds like someone worth knowing." "She was," Mia said softly. Her fingers slipped slightly as she finished. His arm stiffened. For a moment, neither of them moved, and the air between them had weight, had texture, had something neither of them was quite ready to name. She pulled her hands back, stood up, looked at the trees. "We should get more firewood," she said. "Yes," he agreed. Neither of them moved immediately. But what happened in that forest later that day, what stepped out of the shadows on 4 terrible legs, that is what you need to stay for, because that was the night everything changed. If this story is moving something in you right now, if you feel like you've been holding your breath, you're exactly where I was. Stay with me. We're not even to the part that broke me yet. And before we go any further, tell me in the comments, have you ever misjudged someone completely? Have you ever built walls around yourself so high that you forgot there was a person underneath them? I want to hear from you. Now, let's go back to the forest. The forest went quiet. Not the comfortable quiet of morning, not the settling quiet of dusk. This was a different kind of silence, the kind that happens when every creature within earshot has simultaneously decided to hold very still. Mia felt it before she heard it. Sebastian held up his hand, and she stopped mid-step. They were deeper in the trees now, gathering wood, the afternoon light coming in low and golden through the canopy. She looked at him and saw the stillness in his body, the specific, alert stillness of someone listening with everything they have. "Sebastian," she whispered. He pointed at the ground. In the soft mud near the edge of the stream was a paw print. Large, deeply impressed. The claw marks were sharp and deliberate, spaced wide. It was bigger than her hand. Much bigger. "What kind of animal?" she started. "Something large," he said quietly. "A big cat. Most likely." They looked at each other. They walked back to camp at a pace that was technically not running, but was the emotional equivalent of a full sprint. He built the fire higher and hotter than it had ever been, feeding it steadily until the flames reached past her head. Then he took the longest piece of metal from the wreckage and began sharpening one end against a flat rock, slowly, methodically, with the same focus he had given the knot tying and the fire starting and everything else out here. "We'll take turns watching tonight," he said. "I'll go first." She nodded. She lay down, and she told herself she would sleep. She did not sleep. Every snap of a twig, Every rustle of leaf, every sound the forest made became a predator in her imagination. She lay on her back with her eyes open and watched the firelight move on the makeshift ceiling of their shelter, and she thought about all the things she had worried about 6 days ago. Presentation deadlines, whether her apartment lease renewal was due, whether the client would hate the new logo direction. Those things felt like they had happened to someone else, someone living in a different world. A soft, manageable world where the worst thing that happened on a Tuesday was spilling coffee on your sketchbook. And then she heard it. Low, rolling. Something between a sound and a vibration. Something her body understood before her brain did. A growl. She sat up fast. Sebastian was already on his feet, the sharpened metal rod in his hands, standing between her and the darkness. "Don't move," he said, barely a breath. She looked past him. 2 yellow eyes, luminous and steady, hovering just beyond the reach of the firelight. Watching. Patient in the way that only apex predators can be patient, because they have nothing in this world to be afraid of. The panther was enormous. When it stepped forward into the edge of the light, she could see the slow, liquid roll of its muscles under that black coat. It moved like water. It moved like a decision that had already been made. "If I tell you to run," Sebastian said, his voice so low and so steady that she would later think about this moment for years, "you run. Do you understand me? I'm not leaving you." He didn't argue. He tightened his grip on the metal spear. The animal took another step forward. Sebastian lunged toward the fire. He grabbed a burning branch and hurled it toward the panther with a shout that came from somewhere deep and ancient and completely unlike the man who ran quarterly reports. Sparks exploded in a bright arc. The panther recoiled, snarling, a sound like tearing metal. He grabbed another burning branch, then another, building a wall of light and heat between them and the darkness, shouting the whole time, his voice rising until it echoed off the trees and came back doubled. The panther paced, back and forth beyond the fire, its tail lashing, its eyes never leaving him. And then, after a long moment that felt like its own kind of eternity, it turned, and it walked back into the dark. They stood there for a moment, both of them breathing hard. Sebastian didn't sit down that night. He stood at the edge of the firelight for the rest of the night, feeding the flames, watching the forest. Mia watched him from where she lay, unable to sleep, watching the steadiness of his shoulders, the way he turned his head slowly from side to side like a man who had decided that vigilance was the only gift he had left to give. She slept without meaning to, somewhere in the gray before dawn. When she opened her eyes, he was still standing. She pushed herself up. "You haven't slept at all." He turned. The dark circles under his eyes were deep enough that they looked like bruises. His hands, she noticed, had a slight tremor in them. "Couldn't risk it," he said. "Sebastian." She stood and crossed to him and took his arm. "You need to rest. I'll keep watch. You don't know what to look for." "I know how to keep a fire burning," she said. "And I know how to scream if something comes too close." Something softened at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, but the shape of one. He shook his head slowly, then gave a single small nod. He lay down near the fire. She watched him try to close his eyes and watched his body fight it, watched the tension that lived in him refuse to release even now. "I can't switch it off," he said quietly, to the ceiling of leaves above them. Not to her exactly, just saying it out loud into the air, the way people do when something is too heavy to keep holding silently. "I can't just stop." Mia sat beside him. She looked at his face, this face she had once crossed rooms to avoid, and she reached out. She took his hand. He went completely still. "I'm right here," she said. "Nothing is going to happen. I'll wake you the moment anything moves." He stared at their joined hands like he was looking at something he didn't have a word for. Then, slowly, carefully, like something he hadn't done in a very long time, his fingers curled around hers. "Why are you doing this?" he asked. "Because you would do the same for me." Something moved across his face. Something old and tired and quietly undone by the simplicity of that answer. His eyes closed, and this time they stayed closed. For the first time since the crash, Sebastian Harlow truly slept. Mia sat there for hours. His hand was warm in hers. She watched the rise and fall of his chest, and the way sleep made him look younger, made him look like the boy he must have been before grief and his uncle's cold philosophy got to him, before someone convinced him that caring was a weakness and distance was armor. She had spent 2 years thinking she hated this man. She was sitting in a crash forest with his hand in hers, thinking about what it cost to become so untouchable that no one ever tried to touch you. When he woke, the sun was past the middle of the sky. He looked at her for a long, quiet moment. "Thank you," he said. She started to say, of course, the easy, deflecting thing. Instead, what came out was always. The word surprised her. It surprised him, too. He sat up slowly, and he did not let go of her hand. "I need to tell you something," he said. Her heart moved in her chest in a way she did not entirely authorize. "At the office. The way I was with you, with everyone." He paused, looked at the fire. "I never wanted to be that person. I just didn't know how to be anything else." "Why?" she asked. "My uncle raised me after my parents died. He told me that caring makes you weak, that a leader has to stay cold, distant." His voice dropped until it was barely a sound. He said an Ashbourne can never let anyone see that something matters to them. Mia looked at him, and she saw it completely and clearly for the first time. The loneliness that lived behind the distance. The years of it. The weight. "That something matters," she said softly. "That you care." He nodded once. Before she could say anything more, the sky changed. It happened fast, the way forest storms happen, the way life changes all at once and without asking permission. The clouds came in thick and fast, and then the rain came with them. Not soft rain, real rain, the kind that has made up its mind. It hammered through the canopy and found every gap in their shelter, and the fire hissed once and went out. The cold arrived immediately. In the way cold arrives when there's no fire, when your body is already tired, when the forest floor is pressing wet through everything you're wearing. "We have to stay warm," Sebastian said. "Hypothermia isn't just a risk out here. It's a real and immediate danger." He pulled her into the driest corner of the shelter and put his arms around her. She pressed into the warmth of him, and she stopped apologizing for it in her head somewhere around the second minute, because her hands had been numb for longer than that, and surviving was more important than dignity. After a while, the rain drumming all around them like the forest's heartbeat, he spoke again. "I was 15 when my parents died," he said. "Car accident. One evening I had 2 parents and a life I understood, and the next morning I had my uncle and a lesson he intended to repeat until I learned it." She listened. She could feel the words in his chest before they reached the air. "He taught me that the world is full of people who will take from you if you give them the chance. That warmth is a door left unlocked. That feelings are debts." He paused a long time, "So I paid them off early. I stopped having them." "You didn't stop," she said quietly. "You just buried them deep enough that they couldn't get out." He looked at her for a long moment. "At the office," he said, "you always looked at me like I was something to be afraid of. I thought you were. You weren't wrong." She lifted her hand to his face, her cold fingers against the warmth of his jaw. She felt him go still the way he went still when something surprised him. "The man who stayed up all night to protect me," she said. "The man who built fire from nothing and faced a panther in the dark. That is the real you. That's who you actually are." Something moved through his eyes, something that had been locked for a very long time and was only now finding its door. "What if I don't know who that man is anymore?" he whispered. "Then you have time to find out," she said. "You're still breathing. That means you still have time." The rain fell around them. The forest pressed close. "If I kiss you," he said, so softly she almost thought she'd imagined it, "there's no going back." Her heart was loud enough to hear. "Then don't go back," she whispered. And he kissed her. It was not careful. It was not polished. It had none of the careful control that defined everything else about him. It was desperate and honest and full of everything the last several days had built between them. Every fire and every fear and every moment of cold hands finding warmth. When they finally pulled apart, he held her close, and she could feel his heartbeat in the rain and the forest and something else, something that didn't have a name yet but felt like the beginning of one. "I don't want to be that man anymore," he murmured into her hair. "For the first time in my life, I think I actually want to choose." Outside, the storm raged on. Inside their small, imperfect shelter, 2 people who had been falling in completely different ways had finally quietly, landed. But the forest was not finished with them. And what was waiting in the trees further up the mountain? That would ask more of Mia than anything else ever had. The morning after the storm arrived clean and bright and impossibly still. Mia stepped out of the shelter and stretched her aching back and looked at the forest washed pale and new, and for a moment, one single gentle moment, the fear released its grip. The air smelled like rain-soaked earth and green things growing and the kind of silence that follows something loud and means you survived it. Sebastian's hand found hers. Easy, natural, like it had always known the way. "We need higher ground," he said, looking toward a distant ridge where the trees thinned. "A signal fire up there, something visible from the air. Someone will have search planes out by now. Do you think we can make it?" He looked at her. "Together?" "Yes." They spent the morning packing what little they had. He constructed 2 makeshift packs from the remaining cabin lining. She packed the fire kit, the roots, the water. He took the spear. "You're different," she said as she helped adjust the strap on his shoulder. "So are you." She tilted her head. "Ow!" He paused, and she watched him search for the words. "At the office, you always looked like you were holding your breath, like you were waiting to disappear." His voice was quiet. "Out here, you don't hide. You shine." She turned away before he could see her face do what her face did next. She looked at the trees. She breathed. She told herself this was the forest and chemicals and survival bonding and all the other sensible explanations she had. She knew they were not entirely the explanation. The first part of the climb was gentle. Soft moss underfoot, the slope long and forgiving, the trees opening now and then to let through shafts of late morning light. They talked as they walked in the easy way of people who have already said the hard things. He told her about architecture, a passion he had studied and then abandoned when his uncle decided the company needed him. She told him about her grandmother's garden, about the sketchbooks she kept hidden because she was afraid of wanting things she wasn't sure she deserved. "Why wouldn't you deserve them?" he asked. She didn't have a good answer. She had always assumed the smallness was natural. It was just her size. Now the question sat in her like a seed. And then Sebastian stopped. He raised his hand, and she stopped too. She looked at his face and saw something new there. Not fear, not the controlled CEO mask, something between them. Something alert and uncertain. "Listen," he said. She listened. The forest was too quiet. Every bird, every insect, every tiny, ambient, living sound of a working ecosystem. Gone. As if the forest had drawn a single breath and was holding it. Then her foot caught the edge of something beneath the leaves, and she looked down and saw it, half buried in the soft earth. A bone, long, yellowed, human-shaped. Her stomach dropped. Before either of them could speak, Sebastian's weight came down on something hidden beneath the leaves. A snap, and then the world turned over. A rope snare yanked him off his feet and into the air, hoisting him several feet off the ground, hanging suspended and swinging, his face white with the sudden shock of it. "Sebastian!" Her voice came out as a scream. "Don't come forward," he said through his teeth. "More traps. Don't move." She stood frozen, her heart in her throat, looking at him hanging in the trees like some terrible, terrible reversal of everything they had survived together. And then the drums started, low at first, barely distinguishable from the sound of her own pulse. Then louder, then filling the forest completely, surrounding her on all sides, coming from no direction and every direction. Sebastian went very still above her. His eyes found hers. "Mia," he said, and his voice was not calm. Not this time. This time his voice had cracks in it. "You have to hide. Now. No. Listen to me. If they take us both, I'm not leaving you. If they take both of us," he said, and there were tears in his eyes. She could see it from here, actual tears in the eyes of the man who had not shown her a single crack in 2 years. "Neither of us gets out. Please, please hide." Her vision blurred. She pressed the back of her hand to her mouth, and then the figures appeared between the trees. Men painted in dark patterns, wearing animal skins and carved wooden masks, carrying spears with stone tips. Moving with the quiet, practiced ease of people who knew this forest the way Mia knew a spreadsheet. Intimately, completely, without needing to look. They surrounded him. One of them jabbed the rope with the butt of his spear and sent Sebastian swinging, while the others made a sound that was laughter, but was not warm. Mia was behind a tree. She had moved without feeling herself move, some instinct older than thought pulling her into shadow, pressing her flat against the bark. She watched them cut him down. She watched him hit the ground. She watched them bind his hands, then his feet, then lift him between them like cargo and begin to move back into the trees, their drums falling into a steady rhythm around them. She pressed her hand against the bark hard enough to feel the ridges in her palm. And just before the forest took him, Sebastian turned his head. He searched the shadows with those eyes that had once been so cold and were now the opposite of cold, and he found her. She could see him find her. Their eyes held for one moment. He did not look afraid. He mouthed a single word, "Survive," and then he was gone. She stayed behind the tree for a long time. Her legs shook. Her breath came in pieces. The drums faded slowly until they were nothing but a feeling. Then she stood up. She pressed her hands flat against the bark until the shaking stopped. She breathed in until she was full of forest air and cold, and the particular clarity that arrives when everything else falls away and there's only one thing left to do. She thought of him standing between her and the panther. She thought of him staying awake all night while she slept. She thought of his voice saying "survive" and the way it sounded like it cost him everything. "I'm coming," she whispered. "I'm coming for you." She followed the trail they had left. They hadn't tried to hide it at all. Deep footprints in the mud, broken branches at shoulder height, the casual certainty of people who had no reason to be careful. She followed it until the trees thinned and she heard voices and dropped to her belly in the undergrowth. The village spread out before her. Huts with thatched roofs, cooking fires, people moving through the space with the ease of home. Dozens of them. Children running between the buildings. Older people sitting in doorways. A whole ordinary life being lived in the middle of what had felt like wilderness. And in the center, tied to a wooden post, his hands behind him, his suit ruined, a new cut across his cheek, was Sebastian. He was alive. She lay there for hours. She watched every guard rotation, every path between huts, every place where the light didn't reach. She watched the way people moved around the fire in the center, the way certain men positioned themselves between Sebastian and the tree line, the way the evening shift walked a different pattern than the afternoon shift. She thought about the panther. She thought about how, when it had entered the village, chaos had been instantaneous, how all that careful order had dissolved in seconds into panic and flight. She thought about what her grandmother had told her once about certain cultures, certain beliefs, about how a black panther in certain traditions is not a predator to be fought. It is a spirit, a warning, a presence that carries consequences. She didn't know if this village held that belief. She had very few other options. She crept back through the trees until she reached the stream. The air changed there, growing heavier, more still. The panther was on a low branch. She stood there and her entire body said run, and she breathed through it and picked up a stone. Her hand was shaking as she threw it. It struck the branch near the animal's paw. The panther lifted its head. It looked at her with those yellow eyes, patient and ancient and completely unafraid. "Come on," she whispered, her voice breaking. She threw another stone. Closer. The panther dropped from the branch with a sound like almost nothing. It landed, and it looked at her, and it took one step forward. Mia turned and ran. She ran with everything her body had, lungs burning, feet finding roots and leaving them. The sound of large paws behind her growing closer, and then she burst out of the trees and into the village screaming at the top of her voice. The panther came out behind her. For 1 second, the village simply froze, the whole thing, every person, every sound, every breath frozen. And then it exploded. People screaming, scattering, running in every direction, tools dropping, fire scattering sparks, children swept up by running adults, the whole careful order of the place disintegrating into pure animal fear. Mia slipped through the chaos like she was made of shadow. She didn't run. She walked fast, head low, using the panicking crowd as cover the way the crowd itself was using the chaos as escape. She went straight to Sebastian. He stared at her. His mouth opened. "What did you?" "Later," she said, pulling at the ropes. Her fingers slipped. The knots were tight and tied by people who did this regularly. She dug her fingers in and pulled harder. "Mia, leave me and go. Right now." "Absolutely not," she said, and her voice was calm in a way she didn't feel, calm the way you go calm when there's no alternative. "Stop talking and let me." The main knot gave. Sebastian wrenched his hands free and bent to his ankles. A snarl, close and deep, rolled through the village behind her. She didn't look. "Run," he said. They ran. Into the trees, branches across their faces and roots try to hold their feet, and the drums starting up again behind them. Faster this time, and they ran until they couldn't hear anything but their own breathing, and then a little further after that. When they finally collapsed in a small hollow in the hillside, both of them lay on the earth and shook and breathed and stared at the darkening sky through the trees. After a long time, Sebastian turned his head and looked at her. "You lured a panther," he said. Her laugh came out cracked and a little hysterical. It seemed like a reasonable plan. He sat up and pulled her into his arms and held her, and she could feel every year of careful distance he had carried dissolve completely, could feel what it felt like to be held by someone who was not protecting themselves at all. "You're completely insane," he said into her hair. "I learned from watching someone face down a panther with a sharpened stick," she said. He held her tighter. Partners don't leave each other behind. He pulled back slightly to look at her face. His eyes were wet. She realized she was crying too. Not dramatically, just the quiet kind that happens after fear is finally over and the body needs somewhere to put it. "I love you, Mia," he said. She went still. He looked terrified by his own words, which somehow made them more real than anything. "I think I've loved you since you woke up after the crash," he said. "Because when I opened my eyes and you were there, I wasn't alone anymore. And I didn't know until that moment how long I had been." She kissed him before he could take it back. "I love you too," she said. "I love you, and I think I've been arguing with that for 2 years, and I am exhausted from it." His laugh was unexpected, warm, and completely genuine, and she thought it might be the best sound she had ever heard. They made camp without a fire. Too risky. They sat in the darkness with their shoulders touching and their hands joined and above them. Through the canopy, the stars were enormous. Everything they had been to each other 6 days ago felt like a story about other people. If you're still here, if you're still listening, I need you to know that what I felt sitting in that forest in the dark, it was the most terrifying and most alive I have ever been. And the person beside me, the one I had spent 2 years dismissing, turned out to be the most honest, most present, most genuinely human person I had ever known. Tell me honestly, have you ever been through something so hard that it stripped away all the noise and left you with just what was true? I want to know. I need to know I'm not the only one. Now let me finish this story. The helicopter found them the next morning. Mia heard it in her sleep, filtering into her dreams as something mechanical and insistent until it pulled her awake, and she sat up fast and grabbed Sebastian's arm. Listen, he was already awake. The sound grew, unmistakable now, and she stood up so fast her legs barely remembered how legs worked. Sebastian was already moving, scanning the tree-line and the sky and their position. "They can't see us through the canopy," he said. "We need to be visible." They tore the red lining from their packs, every strip of it, and spread it on a small patch of open ground in the rough shape of an axe, weighing the corners with stones. Then they stood at the edges and looked up and waited with their hands clasped together like a prayer. The helicopter passed once and was gone. Mia's breath collapsed. Her eyes stung. It came back, lower this time. It circled, and then, slowly, it began to descend into a clearing further up the slope, and they ran toward it, both of them running, half laughing, half sobbing, stumbling over roots, and not caring at all. The rescue crew asked questions and checked for injuries and wrapped them in foil blankets, and Mia sat on the metal floor of the helicopter with Sebastian's arm around her and the vibration of the rotors moving through her whole body, and she held his hand and she cried. Not quietly, not politely. She cried the way the body cries when it has been holding something for a very long time and has finally been given permission to put it down. He didn't try to stop her. He pulled her closer and pressed his face into her hair, and she felt his breath unsteady against her. 2 weeks later, the hospital room was clean and white, and the food was unremarkable, and it was the most beautiful place Mia had ever been in her life. She sat by the window every morning and watched the sky and thought about how she would never again take something ordinary for granted: a hot shower, a glass of clean water, the sound of traffic below an open window. Sebastian's uncle came on a Wednesday. She heard him before she saw him, that particular cadence of authority that announces itself in hallways. He walked into the room with the energy of a man who had prepared a list of points and intended to work through it efficiently. He spoke about share prices, about investor confidence, about the damage caused by Sebastian's very public display of, and he paused here for the word he wanted, sentiment. There had been press. There had been photographs taken by the rescue crew. There had been a narrative forming that the board found unprofessional. Mia sat very still. Sebastian had been sitting on the edge of the bed. Now he stood up, slowly. The foreline pulled at his arm, and he ignored it. "I'm done," he said. His uncle kept speaking. "I'm done," Sebastian said again, louder and quieter at the same time, if that is possible, which she believed it was. "I'm done living the life you built for me. I'm done being the man you made me into." He looked at his uncle with something she had never seen in his eyes in 2 years of conference rooms, something clear and decided and entirely his own. "I'm choosing what matters." His uncle threatened. Board votes, shared dilution, legacy, responsibility. He pulled out every weight he had ever used to keep Sebastian in place. Sebastian looked at him. "Then do it," he said. "But I won't be that man anymore." The silence that followed was the loudest thing Mia had ever heard. When his uncle left, the door closing behind him with a controlled, expensive click, the room felt like it had grown a foot in every direction. Like something that had been pressing down on the air had simply lifted. Sebastian turned to look at her. He was breathing carefully, the particular breathing of someone who has just done something terrifying and irreversible and is checking to see if they're still standing. "I think I just threw away everything," he said. She stood. She crossed him. She put her hands on his face the way she had in the rain, in the forest, when he had needed an anchor, and she looked at him steadily. "No," she said. "You chose everything. Finally. On purpose. For yourself." He leaned his forehead against hers and closed his eyes and breathed. A few weeks later, he met her at a small coffee shop near the building where they used to work. She arrived early and sat at a corner table and watched people walk by on the street outside and thought about how the world had gone on entirely normally while she was somewhere in a forest fighting to stay alive, and somehow that was both the strangest and most comforting thing she could imagine. He walked in looking different, not in a way she could have pointed to on a list, just different, lighter in some way that had nothing to do with weight. He smiled when he saw her. He told her about the new company. Small, no board, no uncle, just something that made things he believed in, starting with design and architecture and the kind of work that answers to something other than the quarterly report. He slid a piece of paper across the table. "I want you to be my partner," it said. "Equal in everything." She looked up at him. "I don't know how to run a business," she said. "You know how to create things that matter," he said. "And you know me. That's more than enough." She was quiet for a moment. She thought about her grandmother, who had spent her whole life knowing where the medicine was, knowing what the earth gave freely, knowing that the people worth staying with were the ones who looked at you like you were part of the answer rather than an obstacle to it. "Only if we do it our way," she said. "No ruthless deals. No shortcuts. No one treated like a number." "Our way," he agreed. "Tell me in the comments what you think it takes for someone to really, truly change." Because Sebastian changed. I watch him do it, and I still sometimes feel the wonder of that. And if you've dealt with something similar, if you've seen someone choose differently, or if you've had to choose differently yourself, share your story. You're not alone in this. Subscribe for more stories about standing your ground and reclaiming your life, about the people who surprised you and the versions of yourself you found in the hardest moments. The months that followed were the most real of Mia's life. They worked side by side in a small office with too many plants and not enough chairs. They argued about color palettes and celebrated small wins with cheap takeout and occasionally fell asleep on the couch at the end of long Fridays because neither of them had quite remembered to go home. She caught him once, late on a Tuesday, sitting at his desk with a sketchbook she hadn't seen before, drawing buildings. Not corporate structures. Small things. A house with a garden. A community space. Something you could put your hands against and feel. He looked up and saw her looking. Architecture, she said. I was good at it once, he said. Do it again, she said. And just like that, something else unlocked. 6 months after the forest, he took her to a mountain overlook at dusk. The sky was doing everything it could with orange and rose and the particular gold that only happens in the last minutes of sunlight. He had been quieter than usual all afternoon. She had noticed but hadn't asked. He turned to her. He dropped to one knee. In his hand was a simple ring, not the kind that announces itself, just the kind that says, I chose this carefully and I meant it. I don't know what the future holds, he said, and his voice was unsteady in a way she loved completely. I've stopped pretending I know what comes next, but I know that I don't want to face whatever it is without you beside me. I know that you're the person I want to be surviving with, always. He paused. Will you marry me? She pulled him up off his knee and kissed him before she answered, which meant the answer had to wait a moment. And when she finally said yes, her voice had exactly the quality of something that has been held tightly for a long time and is finally allowed to be free. Yes, 1,000 times yes. They were married in a garden the following spring, small and quiet and entirely themselves. No press, no board members, no one to perform for, just the people who had actually shown up for them, which turned out to be not so few as they had once imagined. At the reception, Sebastian pressed a folded cocktail napkin into her hands. She opened it. We agree to love, honor, and survive whatever comes next. Together. His signature was at the bottom. A line below it, blank, waiting. She borrowed a pen from someone nearby and signed her name beneath his. Their story began with a fall out of the sky, with two people who had decided not to know each other, with a crash that stripped away every false thing and left only what was true. It ended in a garden, in a small company with too many plants, in a sketchbook of small buildings, in a ring chosen carefully, in an ordinary Tuesday made extraordinary by the simple fact of being in it with the right person. Sometimes the best love stories start with wreckage. Sometimes you have to fall a long way before you land somewhere true. And sometimes the person you least expected is the one who teaches you that surviving is only the beginning. The rest, the choosing, the staying, the building of something real, that is the part that takes everything you have. And it is worth it. Every terrifying, tender, impossible moment of it. It is worth it.